right, in today's episode, I'm interviewing a good friend of mine, Dan Ring, who's the founder of Elevate, a company that's helping startups establish their HR processes and teams. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here, Lee.
We met in Yokohama at the Yokohama Startup Lunch Club that I have been running for the past couple of months now. And Dan, you have a background with HR specifically and helping startups, but how did you get into that? Can you tell us a little bit about your story and what brought you here to Japan? Yeah.
I graduated in 2011 and was kind of looking for what to do and kind of pursue. And I had been kind of scouring to find opportunities. I come from a small town in the UK, and I was very, very keen to move to London and kind of experience the big city life. So an opportunity came up through a contact of mine to go into an HR internship at a brokerage in London, and that was kind of my first experience of working in the HR space, and that was really to do in actually learning in talent development, and then yeah, kind of from there moved to RBS, Royal Bank of Scotland, as it was known, and kind of spent the majority of my career there. And it was through RBS actually that I ended up moving to initially Singapore and then to Tokyo. They're going through a lot of change, sort of post the major kind of financial crisis in
Hmm.
2008, and that was a huge project that they were looking at, kind of how they could restructure the bank and kind of get it sustainable again, and a big part of that was looking at their Asia business
Mm.
and how they wanted to kind of essentially downsize. They went from about 10 countries to three. So it was a huge, huge project. And they had this, there was a huge team in Singapore at the time. They needed more HR people on the ground to help out with that. So I came over and supported what they call the HR business partners, which are kind of your generalists, the people that partner with the top leaders in the business and actually kind of work on their people strategies and things like that. And then I was initially going to spend a year in Singapore, and I knew that after spending like 10 months, I was like, this is nowhere near enough time. I'm kind of I want to be here longer term, and so I took a permanent role in what they were kind of relaunching their go forward business, their kind of the business that was going to remain after the restructuring was done
Mm.
in that year. So I joined as an HR business partner in that business, looking after sales and trading teams there. I then moved, that was in 2015, I moved to Singapore. 2016, obviously, I went permanent there. And then in 2018, I moved to Tokyo. So there was an opportunity
Mm.
to move to Tokyo to look at really lift the lid on kind of how the Japan HR processes were working. The RBS office used to be much bigger in Japan, and they'd reached a size where they really wanted to kind of align all their processes across all locations and get everything working in a consistent way. So I came over to kind of figure out, could we make some of that stuff work
Mm.
for the regional business, and that ended up with us kind of moving everything HR process wise back into Singapore. So working with the risk and control team and the head of the Japan office and others in the ops team in the Singapore office to kind of get everything back. And then I decided I wanted to stick around in Japan after that, and from there moved to a fintech company doing a regional role there as well. And they had an amazing team of HR people I partnered with in the Philippines actually there, and we worked on kind of merging. There was a recent acquisition. We were kind of merging processes and policies, etc., and then figuring out the talent development process for the team there and kind of what leadership looked like.
Mm.
And I ran a few projects there as well.
I see. I see. And what kind of got you to start your company, venture into entrepreneurship?
Yeah, so I've been mulling the idea of going it alone or kind of trying my own thing for a little while, and it just was a kind of opportunity in that my role essentially finished up at
Mm.
Broadridge. I've wrapped up a couple of projects I was working on, and they didn't really need me going forward. So it was a great opportunity for me to actually give this a go
Mm.
and try it. And I just had my daughter as well, so it was kind of a kind of busy time with family initially. So I spent some time with her when she was born in June last year, and then towards the end of last year, set up the entity here, and then kind of started reaching out to people, talking to people in the market, and I think the thing for me was in the HR space, I always found that the work that I was doing in my HR business partnering job, a lot of it was cyclical. A lot of it was kind of there was a big flurry of activity around a particular project, like a pay round or performance reviews or a org restructure, and you'd have these ups and downs in the cycle.
Hmm.
And it got me thinking that actually, for smaller companies that wouldn't really have anything beyond kind of payroll, perhaps, day to day, kind of doing the operational stuff, actually, if they had access to somebody that worked in people's strategy and could run ideas off of people and kind of get people to help deliver people projects for them,
Hmm.
actually, they could do that without having to pay for a full-time person. I don't actually think you need to. I think a lot of companies, you can deal on a fractional basis with people and have them come in at various key points, and I think actually that long term helps because I think that a lot of founders focus very much on the reactive elements. Am I compliant process wise? Have I got payroll set up? Am I hiring? But beyond that, actually, there's things you can do to sort of think about, okay, what's my long-term strategy? How do I want to design my business in terms of its structure?
Mm.
Where could the potential pain points come up if I have people I'm super reliant on later down the line, or kind of if I know I'm going to get a lot, I need resource at different times of the year depending on what I'm hiring for. And if you get yourself into a situation where you've made lots of hires, and then you've got to make changes, that can be a really painful process. Obviously, it's painful for the employees, but it's equally costly and painful for the founders as well. And I think having a little bit of foresight and thinking about those things up front early, and having a way to access someone that can help you do that can save you a lot of pain down the line.
100%. And you bring up a great point about, preventing these things from happening. A lot of founders, when they're building their company, HR is kind of like something that they think about when they, get to a certain point, whether it be like 100 employees or, something like that, where they feel themselves that the company is big enough. But
Yeah.
what do you think is a good time for, startups to start thinking about this stuff?
Well, I think it starts, really early on when you're a group of early founders getting together. You kind of built your product. You're getting into the flow of doing business, and actually, you have a really clear idea then about what your culture is. What does it feel like for you to work together? What's the ways that you work that work well?
Hmm.
I think kind of underpin culture and in many ways, and actually that then evolves into something that people manage in a certain way, from a classic HR perspective. But I think that it really starts with leaders early on before you even get to the case of hiring someone in HR. I think having you know, taking the time to think about how you work
Mm.
and how you think about delivery and kind of achieving your business goals.
Right.
Doing that stuff is the early stages of what becomes something like a kind of performance framework later down the line.
Well, 100%. And I think that, maybe like the founder's own personal values and the values of the company should be established right from the beginning.
Yeah.
And I guess documenting a lot of some of the things that they care about and some of their processes, like you said, because that's what later on down the line becomes SOPs. That's what, goes into
Yeah.
like, the like KPIs and stuff like that to actually track metrics for like, future employees. So
Mm.
I guess how would we track that, I guess, or what do you advise in terms of how we could establish that?
Well, I think it's as straightforward as kind of writing down. I think if you look at some of the best distributed companies, these fully remote companies, and I think that kind of is an extra layer and sort of has an extra layer of important, the kind of culture and
Mm.
how we work stuff has an extra layer of importance because you're more likely to be fully remote or remote in some way these days.
Mhm.
And I think that spending the time thinking about it and documenting it in a way that when someone comes into the organization, they can go, okay, right, I can read this, I can understand how you guys operate. Or even when you're in the interview process and you're kind of telling people what it's like to work in your company, you have something to draw from, which is telling you, oh, okay, yeah, this is what this kind of company is, this is what they value and prioritize, and this is what they're focused on. And I think doing that early on is a really good way of thinking about it, documenting that, is, and it doesn't have to be really complex at this point. It could be a, you know, Google Doc. You just kind
Hmm.
of throwing stuff down in, and you're kind of structuring it. Thinking about how, and as these things arise, you think about it and you kind of write it down. And it might be a way you guys want to do meetings, for example, which is obviously always a big time sink for people. But thinking about what is the way that you guys how what's best for your business and the way you kind of operate for meetings, and what's most efficient, and based on kind of how your team is, if you're in person or you're kind of distributed, what's the best format for a meeting. I think stuff like that is really important to kind of think about. And there's loads of resources out there that you can draw on, inspiration you can draw on. Lots of companies these days publicize their handbooks or their internal documents, really because they want people to understand before they hire. Actually, this is how we work. So, if you want to have we want you to have a good understanding about how we operate, as well as obviously sharing best practice.
I actually did this exercise a few times where I thought, okay, what are my values and what do I want future employees to know about me and my company?
Mm,
It's really good because it also helps me stay in check. It's like, okay, am
yeah,
I performing to the values that I set? And it's good reflection type of exercise as well.
definitely.
That's awesome, man. And that kind of ties into also like company culture. What is your definition of like company culture?
I mean, the culture already typically will be the way you already operate. So if you reflect hard on kind of the way you are kind of operating, you can see that will tell you what your company culture is. Whereas, lots of companies like to put nice buzzwords on a wall, but
Mhm.
actually, when it comes to the way they operate, they don't maybe follow those. Particularly in moments of crisis or moments of real tension or difficulty. We revert to type in many ways, and actually, it's important to kind of be aware when obviously you don't want kind of toxicity or negativity in your culture, but it's important to recognize that this is the way you operate and this is the way you deliver effectively,
Mhm.
and actually this is the way that you as a group prefer to operate, and
Mhm.
therefore you need to be use that as your base for your company culture. It can help to have someone come in and help you do that, because I think sometimes it's a bit difficult when you're in the weeds to kind of go, okay, well, how do I write down what my culture is? I think having someone observe it externally can help. I think that's why HR tends to be very closely intertwined with culture. Is it tends to be a little bit removed from the rest of the company, and
Mhm.
can sort of reflect and go, okay, well, how is this company operating, and kind of what are the trends, and what does it tell us about what our values are?
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
actually a great point as HR being the mediator. I've felt some organizations, the HR either has the employees' backs or the company's backs. In your experience, like which one is it usually?
Well, I mean, you are hired by the company typically, so you have to ensure that the safety of the organization is there. Having said that, I mean, as with any as with anyone that's sort of got principles, I think you have to be ready to call out when things are not appropriate and things aren't being done in the right way. And I've always felt that I've always listened to the people I've been supporting, and kind of provided a space to understand their point of view, even if it's differing to what the company's is. I want to listen carefully to what they say. I then kind of bring the two together and think about what's the best approach to minimize risk on both sides,
Mhm.
depending on what the situation is. But I mean, you have to take a company focused approach. You're there to deliver for the company, but actually, the interests of the individual are quite often, in the best of times, aligned with the company. So that's when things work.
Yeah.
When it's not, that's challenging. But I think you just have to make sure. I always used to, when you have to make tough decisions or you're in a sensitive situation, you have to think, okay, am I doing, if someone was interviewing me down the line, is what I'm doing, would I be happy to, talk about this at length and in detail? And
Mm.
obviously, I, recognize we're in an interview right now, but I would say that the my approach would be, yeah, like, do you feel like you can stand, if this was on your permanent record, could you stand again, could you stand to it and justify why they made certain decisions and stuff, and don't make them lightly as well. I think it's people's lives you're talking about, so you have to, their livelihoods, and I think you can have a significant impact, so you have to be really aware of that when making those tough decisions.
100%. And one of the most difficult decisions for any founder or any manager, employee, somebody who manages people or is in charge of people is when to hire and when to fire somebody.
Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
HR has plays a big role in that. A lot of times managers don't want to fire somebody directly, so they just send HR to do it, right? Or something
Yeah.
like that. How important is hiring in your mind for especially for startup?
I think for startups, it's everything. Actually, there's a great saying I heard: that hire slowly, fire quickly, which I think is, I don't know who said that, but I think it's a great term. If okay, if a little, perhaps callous, but I think it is, it's true. You need to be super careful with who you hire, and I think a lot of organizations, and not just startups, but people, they're desperate to hire into a role because typically for bigger organizations, it's taken ages to get approval for something, and then by the time they actually have to get it through the door and they get it, they're desperate to get these people into roles. You've really got to resist the urge to just hire because it's going to fill a seat. And I think that spend the time training your managers on how to interview, how to assess, and make sure they're comfortable having those discussions, because it not only allows you to get the best from whoever you're interviewing and get the most information, the most data points that you need to make a decision, but equally it ensures your managers are sufficiently prepped to sell the company in the right way. Because even the people you don't hire, you're obviously selling to them. You're selling your brand. So I think that's really important. But going back to kind of selecting people, I think it's so critical to get the right people. And I would say, actually, we tend to hire, sometimes fall into the trap of hiring based on the kind of experience, or the kind of whether they could necessarily do the day to day of the role. And actually we focus less on the mindset and kind of how they would operate in the environment of the company. And I think we need to be really, really careful. It's better to hire someone you can bring in that will stick around and kind of take the initiative, and will learn how to do a role, than it is necessarily to hire just because they can do a role, rather than and they don't have the right personality or mindset.
It's so hard to find though in an interview, man. I used to be a recruiter for a couple of years, and that's one of the things where, matching the person to the culture or to the company is so difficult, especially, as an external recruiter. I didn't really know about the company culture or stuff like that, just going based off what they said, right? So, what's some advice you have for, any founder who's trying to assess somebody, see if they have that right mindset or see if they have the right attitude to come into the company.
So I think when it comes to interviewing, think really carefully about what you're looking for. And I work with people who are kind of preparing for interviews, and I always say to them, look, an interviewer, especially if you've already done the role previously, if you're a graduate, maybe it's a little different. I'm happy to talk about that separately, but I think that for a experienced hire, I say, look, you've already got the experience. You can talk at ease about the role and the technicality of the technical aspects of the role, but what the interviewer wants to understand is how you approach your work. What's the kind of values that you apply in your work consistently? And not just in one role, but kind of how you tackle, how you manage client relationships, or how you deal with challenging colleagues, or stuff like
Mm.
that. And also, I always tell people, have an example of when you have something's not gone right, you've got something's gone wrong, some kind of error that you've had to learn, that either you've had to take responsibility for, but also that you've had to learn from, or a problem that perhaps you created or were part of, but then you fixed and solved, and how you went through that, and how you managed the stakeholders in that situation. And I think you can flip that around to the interviewer and say, well, to the interviewer, think about focusing, honing in on what those things are. You want to see how this person acts under pressure or kind of in a problem scenario, and are they open to talking about it? Have they got enough self-reflection to be able to say, okay, yeah, well, I, made this mistake, but I actually solved it, and actually be able to kind of talk constructively about the situation. I think that in itself, any interview you go into, I would always ask a question like that because I just think it's so telling.
Yep.
So there's that, and yeah, and I think try and drill down into what the person's values are, and by that I mean when they've had to make big decisions in their life, what did they prioritize? What were they looking at? And why are they pursuing the things that they've done? And they may not have pursued. They may not have. They may have done lots of different things
Mhm.
in their career, which is absolutely fine. I think that's it's good to have a breadth of experience. But is there some kind of thought process or through line about that, or have they been reactive? Because I think that will tell you a lot about how that person thinks, and long term and strategically.
Mm.
So I think if they're not being strategic in how they're presenting their career, are they going to be strategic in your business? And I think that's it takes time for people to figure that out. And but I would say that everybody, even those that have had to job hop a little bit, and maybe the decisions were financial initially, but it's not always been financial. And actually, you can create a cohesive narrative about what your career experience is, and all that tells you a lot about who that person is and kind of how they present themselves, how they would operate in
Yeah.
the business, come from just a personality perspective and resilience perspective.
What are your thoughts on like giving somebody a task or a project to do and kind of like doing like a trial period with them? Because there are people who are technically sound on paper, and especially
Yeah.
with AI now, you can, anyone, AI can make my resume sound like a superstar's resume,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, of course, yeah.
But like, is this something that you see companies doing more often where they're giving somebody like a project or a task or like a challenge during the interview process? And how would you see that going?
You tend to see that more at the junior level, I would say. So if someone's kind of untested, then I get that, having tasks or challenges,
Mm.
to do is a good way of doing it. I actually think that a better way is there a way you could bring them on in some project-based capacity or temporary capacity and kind of, test them out
Mm.
more, and maybe this is a bit more applicable to people with a bit more experience, and say, look, come in and work on this project with us. If this goes well, then let's talk about something a bit more long term or something like that. I think might make it a bit more valuable and meaningful. I think sometimes people feel like they're running on a hamster wheel if they have to go through this, and you want to balance the testing process with the candidate experience as well, because it can be it's a tricky line to get right sometimes. But I would say that in terms of companies actually kind of doing the testing, like, are they? So I would say that, yeah, it's more at the junior end of the market. I'd say that I've only really seen that happen.
Mm.
What about
But
yourself? Have you seen it happen more in more senior roles?
no, but actually, what you had said was actually really interesting. Now that I'm thinking about it, bringing on somebody as like maybe a freelancer or a contractor for a certain amount of time and trying them out before extending them a full-time offer might actually end up saving the company tons of money. Not only will they get work done for that 1 month or 3 months or whatever, but then they can get rid of them afterwards without having to, spend so much money with firing and rehiring somebody. I think companies waste millions of dollars a year on bad hires,
Do you know
right?
how much it costs if you make a bad hire? Do you know what kind of the rough
No, please
estimate is?
enlighten me.
It can be about twice an annual salary. It can be. It can go up to that kind of level. And obviously, if you're hiring in senior roles, it can be really, really expensive if you make the wrong hire.
Oh, so can you, yeah, actually break down what are the costs that go into this? Like when we think about that, why is it so expensive when you make the wrong hire?
Obviously, there's the recruitment costs, which were kind of obvious. But you think about the onboarding and introductory process of bringing that candidate in. So that's kind of the time spent bringing them up to speed in onboarding sessions with other colleagues, the materials that are prepared for the workshops. Maybe it's external workshops or internal. Either way, you've got to kind of put the time and materials into producing that and getting that ready. The qualifications and licenses they may need to perform in their role, particularly if they're in like a regulated environment. They have to, go through that process of getting certified. And then obviously, if they're not performing, you've got things like lost productivity. They need other people to support them, which is impacting their productivity. You've got to coach and mentor them, which is a drain on your kind of management. You've got the salary costs, obviously, and then you've got the termination costs, which can be really expensive in places like Japan. Then you've got to go through the whole recruitment process again and start the whole process again. And this is not to mention the morale impact. Bringing the wrong person into the team can have a far-reaching effect, particularly if the personality or the kind of mentality of that person isn't right. You can end up increasing turnover, which is going to increase costs again, which goes even further. So there's a whole range of things that can go wrong that people don't see immediately that can have a massive impact on your cost.
Now, this is definitely rings true for corporations, especially because, corporations, they have way more processes. Like you said, they're more regulated, things like that. But for startups, the cost might be a little bit low at the beginning, but it could have wide-ranging effects, especially if you're bringing on somebody who's potentially equity or,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
definitely.
you know,
It can make or break your business if you bring on someone senior and you don't you're not prepared to kind of absorb the pain if it goes wrong. Which is why I think, and I've talked about this a bit on my LinkedIn, but the fractional model is one that I think a lot of smaller companies and I think startups are beginning to see as the right approach, which is where you bring in perhaps senior people or even going down the chain to other managers and other roles. You bring in people on a ideally B2B type arrangement, on a few days a week. And actually, what's different between these people and a kind of typical consultant or a kind of contractor or freelancer is that these, particularly at the senior level, get embedded into your leadership team. They're there for the long term. They're not there just for always that they're not there kind of just to kind of complete the job and get out. Typically, and in a fractional leadership role, they'll be there to actually kind of help you in your business and kind of operate as your CFO or CHRO or whoever kind of inside your business and actually make sure that the strategy's there and that it's delivering for you. Um, and they'll sit at the leadership meetings and kind of or board meetings or whatever setup you have, and they'll be there available to talk to. And actually, that approach means you can access far more experienced talent at a fraction of the cost.
Mm,
Sometimes equity is involved. I think the preference is there's some kind of fixed sort of retainer cost, but most fractional people, particularly in the more experienced space, are they understand what a startup is going through, so they want to be flexible in their approach. So that can be a really good way to access the right sales expense, the right sales talent, or the right technical ability. And
mm.
maybe they come in and they set up your technical or your sales team and they develop the strategy, and then they are there to manage performance, but they actually don't need to be there 5 days a week to do that.
Right. Some of these executives cost anywhere from like, what is it, like 200 or 500K or more for a
Yeah,
year sometimes,
yeah,
right? If you can get them for a fraction of the cost, so whether it be for a year or a contract basis, I think that definitely saves
yeah.
startups.
You get them for a few days a month. They come in. They can have a tremendous impact on your
Mm.
business, and even in larger organizations as well, it can be beneficial. I mean, you can be saving 40+% on costs for these types of roles, for the equivalent on a salaried kind of permanent role. Yeah, so it's one to look at, and I actually think that a lot of people. So this is a growing industry here in Asia, particularly in Singapore and India as well. To a certain extent, there's a growing fractional community. I'm a member of this regional group, and it's amazing how much it's grown. It's gone from about 300 people to over 1,500 in the space of a year. So there's a huge wealth of talent there. And I think Japan still hasn't quite caught up yet, but I think startups are going to be the group that actually pave the way on this.
Mm.
Um, and I think that they have an opportunity. I always think a startup have a unique opportunity to set up their organization and design their organization in a way that is, really set up for the future rather than kind of just using what we typically do, which is this top-down hierarchical approach to org design.
At what stage should a startup consider getting a fractional CMO, CTO, whatever, right? What stage do you think is the best for them? Would it be somewhere in the seed stage or like, after post product market fit? When do you think would be the best time for them to consider that?
Good question. And I think it largely depends on what the challenge is that you're trying to solve. And I would say, rather than think about, and I'll talk about this more when we talk about all design, but rather than think about roles as a seat that needs to be filled with a title and a person, think about the problems that you're trying to solve and what skill set or systems do you need to solve those problems.
Mm.
And then that will tell you what kind of person you need to solve that problem. But I would say that, for example, I think that when maybe you've got your MVP and you've got some seed funding or something, and you're working on refining that product market fit. At that, maybe you're towards the end of that process, you're going to be at the right point to bring on a salesperson. Maybe you don't have the capability to think about sales strategy in the scale that you're looking to. So maybe it's earlier if depending on, and again, I think it depends on the skill set you have internally as well. So if you don't have someone with a strong finance background, for example, maybe you do need to talk to someone a bit earlier than
Mm.
than you would if you had someone in there that could do it.
I wonder at what point maybe an advisor could become potentially fractional, CTO, CFO, CMO, or even CEO. Do you think there will be fractional CEOs in the future, or
Oh,
what do
there
you?
already are. There already are
Sure.
fractional CEOs. Yeah, yeah. People come on as fact, and I think it's something that it is the future. I think in terms of the way we structure. I would say that what you might find is a more traditional model, and I think that we again org design stuff, but I think that having a core group of people who are kind of maybe they have equity, maybe they were there when they founded the company, and they're kind of really wedded to this for the long term, and this is what they focus on. Maybe that's your core group that exists, as employees per se of the entity, and then beyond that, you've got a group of fractional talent that you're bringing into the organization and kind of helping you develop your systems. So you don't necessarily have teams and roles, but you have systems which you need to maintain to achieve your business objectives. And you've spent the time working out what those systems are, which means that you don't rely on an individual, you don't rely on a specific team. You can actually move people across that depending on their skill set and what they want to develop. And then obviously depending on demand and kind of how big, how successful the business is at one time or another, maybe they're more utilized or yes, less utilized, depending on kind of what they need.
Let's talk about this org chart now,
Yeah.
right? Because that's one of the main things that I think a lot of founders don't really understand how important it is. If you have just this, funnel of talent that goes up the top making decisions and stuff like that, it can create lots of bottlenecks as the company scales, right? So
Yeah, totally.
the more modern approach is a more of a flatter structure, right? Or a
Yeah.
more dynamic structure. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're seeing and, what you think is best for them?
Yeah. So I think there's still a majority of companies still follow a traditional model. You have like a CEO at the top and then a management team and then people below that. Um, there are flatter structures. I think the challenge with the flatter structure depends on what that person's role is within the organization. How compelled are they to kind of continue pursuing and doing the thing that they're doing? How
Mm.
much opportunity is there to grow for them?
Mm.
I think one of the challenges of bigger organizations with smaller branch offices, for example, is that they don't always have, they tend to follow a more typical traditional vertical model of
Mhm.
progression. And what they don't have is a structure in place which they can sell to people in smaller locations that you're going to grow in this way over the long term, because quite often there isn't, because they don't need people above a certain level in these smaller places unless they're going to move to the home office. How do you retain them? And then you end up with situations where you've got really, really good people who you've become ever more reliant on in these locations, and the management team are tearing their hair out because they're like, well, if this person leaves, or the moment they tender their resignation or express interest in tendering the resignation, everyone's in panic mode because they don't know how to retain this person, and you end up doing things like paying different packages out, which kind of is not kind of consistent with how you approach compensation or performance management typically, and because you desperately need this person. So I think moving from a model which is has that approach and is more actually systems based. So you're you don't have a reliance on an individual. Everything's well documented. Everything is kind of automated. Ideally, you obviously if you have people performing a role which is the same thing day in day out, and they're required to kind of be there to do that thing. That's an automation opportunity. That might even be a product opportunity right there, right? You should be thinking about the roles that people perform in that way, I think, and saying, okay, well, what part of the system is this role with? Separate the role out into the actions and activities of that person. What parts of the systems that we have do they belong to? And then who's responsible for that overall system, and what skill set do we need to maintain it? And then what you do is you can move people in and out, much more in a much more fluid way. The challenge that people would always say to that is, okay, well, okay, we do that. We say we do that. How do I retain people? I'm giving them kind of, they don't know if their job's going to go or whatever, down the line. They, if depending on utilization or if we automate something, you know, what do we do to keep them developed and interested and kind of growing and staying with us? My answer to that would be, well, help them build something outside of their role, help them become a thought leader in their industry, help them build their own business or their own service business that they want to kind of develop out, and give them the skills and the experience that enable them to achieve their own financial independence. And that way you will not have people moaning about how much you're paying them or kind of clamoring for more pay rises. You'll actually have people saying, wow, these people helped me build something for myself. I'm always going to be loyal to these guys because they set me on this track and they gave me this experience,
Mm.
and I'm always there to support them. And then you've suddenly got an alumni network of top people who you've built up into successful entrepreneurs or thought leaders in their own right, who you can always rely on to come back in because you have this fungible model. They can always come back and help build those systems and kind of refine, work on projects, or you never lose talent in that way.
That's actually a great model. I wish more
Yeah,
organizations
it's
do that.
it's it's still kind of theoretical, but I think that and that obviously, practically speaking, I think you've got to do it in baby steps. But the thing I would say is think in systems, don't think in roles.
Hmm. I
Um,
think that's going to be even more important now because, this has come up on previous podcasts where, junior level people, they're going to have the hardest time to find
oh, they
positions.
already are. Yeah.
Yeah, because everything is all AI now, AI automated. And how are
Mm.
you going to get people to that level without them actually being hired? And I think one of the you said was like, get them into the position, have them work until they get to a certain point, and then develop them so they can develop something outside. So if the company does have to get rid of them, they're empowered. And I think that's a great model. Yeah.
Yeah, and I almost don't think of it as kind of getting rid of people. I think what happens is you always have this maintain a relationship with these people,
Yeah.
and then you kind of stay in the network and you have this pool that you just come back to. Because which always surprised me that, even in big organizations, the people that would come back and the amount of people that would come back. And I was like, wow, you spend all this money kind of going through these rounds of layoffs or hiring, and actually you've got these great people in your network who know your business, who had a good experience working with you and can come back could come back at any point. Why not have a system where they can come in and help out with certain things and move things? The companies always have projects that they can't staff because they're thinking in headcount.
Mhm.
Why not start your kind of journey down this road by building out a robust alumni network and kind of using them
Hmm.
for side projects in your business.
I absolutely love that.
Mm.
Like why not keep the talent in your network forever, right? Like
Yeah,
in some way, some form or fashion. We do that for universities. We have alumni networks. Why not companies?
yeah,
Universities, you learn, obviously knowledge and skills, but in companies, you actually put it to practice. And it will save money for when
yeah.
you need to rehire somebody because they already know your organization.
Yeah, exactly. You're going to save yourselves tons of cost. And the thing I say, I mean, they do exist. Alumni networks do exist, and there are companies that have versions. Maybe not this model, but they kind of have a model which is, they'll have people on the bench and then they rotate them out and they put them into, look at a lot of the large management consultancies, for example, and the way they operate on projects and stuff and moving people around. But I think this is just one level. This is just, I think we can take that further. I think, we could all be operating more like that. And where you've got roles where you don't think you can do that, I think the question is, why is an AI not doing this? Or why am I not building a system to do this then?
That's true. Yeah, the amount of people that have ex Google or ex Apple or ex all this on their resume, we should have an ex alumni network for the FANG
Yeah,
company.
yeah,
But yeah, really interesting, man. So I
yeah,
wanted to switch gears and talk a little bit about leadership and
yeah.
the importance of leadership within an organization like you said, or other organizations now, but particularly for startups. A lot of times startup founders, they're young, they're like 20, in their 20s, they don't know anything about leadership, never managed anyone before. Their company starts scaling, they hit product market fit, and then they suddenly have 50 people that they have to manage and lead. Uh,
Yeah.
how important is learning leadership skills, and how would somebody in that position go about learning them?
It's a good question. I think it's really challenging. I think leading a team and managing a huge department are very different things. I would say the two things I would say to be most aware of is, first of all, be aware of yourself and
Mm,
your own leadership style and your gaps as well as your strengths, because people will operate around you, and some of the worst leaders I've seen, you end up running the business in a way because of the personality of the individual rather than necessarily because it's the best and most efficient way to get things done. And I think you've got to make sure that you are not getting in the way of the business by being self-aware and recognizing where your gaps are. I also think that it's so important for you to have strong connections with not just your management team, but the kind of the broader team that you're working with. Be accessible, and be able to create a culture where people can speak up and challenge. I think in terms of learning these things, you can learn them from an early stage. If you're working as a junior in a company, quite often you have to influence others, or you have to work alongside people who are perhaps more experienced than you, but they're kind of you have to operate on a peer level, or you have juniors that you have nothing to do with, but actually they need you to help them understand how things work, and I think be open to that and understand that that is building your skill set for when you become a leader later down the line. And it's sometimes it's just being a good person and being kind
Yeah.
of a good corporate citizen is actually a great way to become a good leader, because you can learn a lot about what makes a good leader. And I've worked all sorts of leaders over the years, but I think that I would say the most impressive leaders I've worked with have been people who they can operate at different levels with different people. They can, they know how to operate at the kind of board level and how to get things done and get what they need done. But they can talk to juniors in their team as well, and be open and accessible to them. And I think those are really critical, as well as understanding. Your role as a leader really is to enable others to do the job rather than you do the job yourself. So you need to make sure that you are being an enabler, and that might be telling the story. It might, carrying that kind of helping people understand the strategy. I think that's so critical. But it's also just being being able to operate the different levels and also just be accessible. And one other thing I'd say is that understand your teams and your business. I think the most impressive leaders are people that they know of who everyone is. Maybe not everyone in their organization, but maybe like one or two levels down. They have relationships with those people, and obviously
Mhm.
depending on the size of your organization, that will change. But don't just be stuck with your management team and kind of working with your top leaders, but actually be talking to everybody because they'll tell you so much about what's going on in your organization, in your group, in who you're responsible for, and it will help you learn and understand when things come up. You just can solve problems so much more easily.
You bring up a really good point about being in touch with the people who are doing most of the legwork. I've worked in organizations where the CEO was in like some other state or like some other place, right? And we never got to see them. So it's all based on our perceptions of what we hear from others. Whereas if you, the CEO of the leader, are actually talking to the people who are doing most of the dirty work for you, I think
Yeah.
it gives you a better connection and you understand more. In my opinion, the good leaders are the ones who listen more than they talk, right? These are the people
Yes.
that they listen to everyone, whether it be somebody who's in the lower ranks to somebody who's in the higher ranks. They know what's going on in the organization and they take in a lot more than what they push out, right? And you have to have control of your ego, I think, you know?
Yeah, well, you need, as I say, self-awareness. I mean, if you have an ego, you need to understand that you have one and that you
Yes.
need to kind of pull that into check. I've worked with many, many very, very good leaders, and some of which have had big egos, but they sort of use it to they use it in a way that's sort of constructive, I guess, or they can
Yeah.
kind of it gives them a confidence that allows them to operate at a certain level. But you definitely don't want it to get in the way of you being able to kind of operate with the people below you.
Because it can, man. It really can.
Yeah, it really can. Yeah, totally. And yeah, I think self-awareness, being self-aware is probably the number one thing I would say is understand who you are as a leader and how you operate. And you'll be, and then I think that helps you understand how you impact others. I mean, I've definitely had situations where you operate in a certain way, you don't realize the impact, or someone comes to talk to you about it and says, actually, the way this happened, this person felt this, and I
Mhm.
think, and you go, what did that, how could they possibly interpret what I said in that way?
Mhm.
And realize that, yeah, people are different, and you have to be ready to kind of, go and talk to those people and kind of understand that not everyone thinks the way you do, and that you need to kind of be aware of that in the way you operate.
100%. And I actually don't think it's bad for a leader to admit when they're wrong. I think like doing that it shows that it's okay for others to make mistakes and admit when they're wrong and take
Yeah,
responsibility. And that's setting the culture, that's leading by example. These are all
yeah,
great things that leaders should do.
really good things. um you just kind of jogged my memory on something else. I'd also say the other thing is, don't be afraid to have the difficult conversations when you need to. I think that leaders sometimes shy away from that. Now, maybe actually, when you look at kind of management versus leadership, I think the leaders are the people that maybe don't shy away from those things, and managers typically perhaps are more reluctant, in kind of engaging with those difficult conversations.
I actually had this training in my management training program right out of university. I did difficult conversation training and
Yeah,
it was very enlightening, let me tell you. Like some of
yeah.
the things that we had to
It's.
learn.
I mean, everyone struggles with them. Like even today, I mean, it takes practice to do these things, and to have an approach which allows you to, just get it out there and talk to someone. I've done many in my time, and it's always difficult, but you just got to have an approach. You got to have a structure and approach to take.
It's always difficult, but two things happen to that. One, the other person will respect you because you're actually having that difficult conversation.
Yeah.
Two, you're getting to the point of what's actually causing the controversy or,
Mm,
the issue, and that will be solved. Imagine not having it, a difficult conversation, and then resentment builds over time and it blows up. This happens in relationships, but also happens in work too. So when
mm,
I learned that, it helped me in all areas of my life. I was able to use those skills in my relationships and also in work to, yeah, just get over conflict. You know,
good. Yeah.
absolutely, man. So, we had some really great discussions about leadership. We talked about HR. We talked about, company culture. Is there anything that we didn't get to talk about that you think we should have spoken about?
I guess just on the topic of talent, maybe just could we talk about talent in a kind of sort of
Absolutely.
vague way? Um, and it comes back to what I was talking about with the kind of the fractional thing as well, with kind of people kind of growing people in the right way. I think it's so important to understand who your top people are in the organization. And as your organization grows, you won't always know. You think you know, but actually, when you get around the table and you hear the other people's opinions, the other managers that you've been talking to, actually, you build up, you have a different impression of someone. And I think that taking the time to kind of focus on identifying who the top people are, and then having a plan to grow them. And I think one of the things organizations do is they know who their top people are. They know who they're kind of really, they like them, but they don't know. They're too scared to kind of say, okay, well, we need them here now. We don't really want to move them to something else just yet. When it comes up, maybe we'll move them.
Mm,
And the next thing you know, they're a flight risk. So be ready to move someone before you think that, before it's, don't get too comfortable with someone in a particular role. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying about systems rather than individuals. It works both ways in the sense that, yes, okay, it removes the risk if you've got someone that threatens to resign and you desperately need them to do that role. But it also means that you can move your talent around in a much more fluid way, which
mm.
companies often struggle with.
Yeah, I want to briefly touch on how do we compensate these people who are the top performers? Is it just like with bonuses or is it, increased salaries? And how should startup founders who are, identifying the core talent within their groups? So a lot of times startups have generalists that know how to do everything, but if
Yeah.
there's a rising star, there's somebody who's really showing like leadership qualities and things that could be like a, manager level role or a leader role. How do we go about, I guess, rewarding them for those qualities?
Well, I think obviously compensation is one aspect, but I think that you should think about what do they want? What's their motivations? What do they want to do? And build that into the profiling process. So make sure you're having detailed conversations with them about what they are looking to achieve. And that doesn't necessarily mean in their work, because the first thing someone will talk about is saying, oh, I want to go to this level, I want to do that, I want to. But for example, when my move to Singapore, it was because I said I wanted to go and spend some time abroad. I wanted to go and experience, have an experience which was different. And it was only through sharing that actually, something was, and it's a testament to the managers that were kind of managing me at the time, is that the approach was share what share what you want to do, and we'll make it happen. We'll do our best to kind of figure out a way to make it happen. And I think if you've managed to get that kind of way of thinking embedded, I think that can be really, really, really huge, because then people will come to you and say, most of the time, managers are like, just tell me what you want. Like, come and talk to me. And I don't know, or the leaders are like, if people just said what they wanted, we'd figure out a way to do it. And you'd be amazed if
Yeah,
you actually go to your leaders and go to your managers and you say, I want to do this, I want to do that, then you'd be amazed how much they would say yes to.
that is advice for life, man. Honestly, if you don't ask, you don't get,
Yeah, it's
right?
so true.
Many
Yeah,
people are so afraid to ask,
yeah,
I heard a statistic that, usually women especially, they do not ask for raises like men do. And that's a
no.
big problem, right? So, yeah, if you don't ask, you won't get. And that's, yeah.
And that's why it's up to managers and to leaders to actually create the environment where people do ask,
Yeah.
or encourage them to have a think about it and ask. And it may not happen immediately. It might not happen in the first conversation you have with them, but you need it's the onus is on you to cultivate and kind of find out, particularly, and I mean this in the context of, top talent, people that you really want to retain. You
Right.
need
You
to
don't want
find out what's driving
you don't
them.
want the non-top talent asking for raises or bonuses or anything like that, right?
Just
But yeah,
handed them out, handed them out. Yeah, yeah.
absolutely, exactly. All right,
Yeah.
man. So we have a closing tradition on this podcast where the
Mm,
last guest left a question for you, and you'll leave a question for the next guest. Are you
go
ready
on
for
then.
the question?
Ready.
All
Hit
right,
me.
cool. All right. So the question is, what is your weaker part of your personality or your skill sets that you're aware of? Talk about self-awareness. And how do you work to compensate that? Meaning, how do you mitigate those weaknesses?
I like to do lots of different things, right? I like to kind of, and this is why I'm kind of loving the entrepreneurial journey because I'm able to talk to so many different people, look, about their businesses. And there's loads of different challenges, and that's great. I also love to dig into something and can get really focused in on one thing, and actually balancing the two can sometimes be a bit difficult. Like kind of just organizing things in a way that that makes that sort of means that you're moving forward can be challenging. So for what I like to do is I like to go back to systems. I like to have some structure, and I don't always follow it. But you put it in place, and if you can get 80% of the way there, and you stick with it, you can. It gives you a foundation to operate with.
Mm.
So that's what I like to do because I get excited and I get to jump into things, and I have to have a bit of structure to kind of help me, you know, make sense of what I'm working on and kind of what I'm focusing on. So yeah,
Absolutely. It could be very, exciting to get into a new project, but if you're already working on three or four different things, it can be a distraction. So, absolutely. Cool, man. Awesome. So now it's your turn to leave a question for the next guest.
what's been the biggest leadership challenge in your career or in your experience? What did you get wrong, and how did you, or what if you got it wrong? What did how did you solve it? And if you got it right, how did you get there?
Okay, cool. That's a good one. Yeah, leadership's coming up a lot recently, so I'm super excited to dive deeper
Yeah.
into topics with people. Awesome, Dan. Well, you're doing great work, man. I think that, startups around the world really need to start thinking about their HR processes, especially as their teams start to scale.
Mm,
And hopefully, anyone who needs your services, I'm going to link all your stuff below so they'll be
thank
able
you.
to contact you. But yeah,
And I would
uh,
just say actually just just reach out and let's have a chat because I actually love hearing and talking to people about kind of what's going on from their kind of people strategy perspective. It's just super interesting and it's great for me to understand as well. And if there's anything I can share and it's over a coffee, absolutely no problem at all.
absolutely, man. Absolutely. And I heard that you're got something in the works of a, potential startup tech project.
Yeah, well, it's kind of it's still pending at the moment. But I would say actually, yeah, anyone in if you're in procurement or supply chain management, reach out as well. I'll be buying you a coffee and we'll be talking. But yeah, that's all from me on that one.
Love it, man. No, it's awesome. Yeah, it's exciting stuff. Dan, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Real pleasure. Thanks, Lee. It's brilliant to be here. And you are, by the way, I just say, the things you're doing for the startup community in Yokohama is just awesome. So thank you for all that you do.
That's a wrap for this episode of the Product Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a like and subscribe on YouTube, follow us on Spotify, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps this channel grow. And if you are a product manager or a startup founder who wants to share your story or some of the struggles that you've gone through in your career, then definitely reach out to us. We'd love to have you on. And until next time, happy building, everyone.